The Smurg by Jessiy. Read by Alex Mabella. Chapter 3. Hermione and Malfoy stood in front of the large tree that stood as a sentinel on the slight rise in the Malfoy gardens. She took a deep breath and plucked the sole pomegranate from the lower branches, letting the firm fruit roll between her hands. "Wish me luck," she whispered.
"If anyone can save us all, it would be you, Hermione."
With a nod, she cracked open the fruit and gathered a small handful of the juice-plumped seeds and brought them to her mouth and chewed, savoring the tart sweetness and hoping that she would travel to a time that would enable her to save everyone she loved. As she swallowed, a wave of dizziness engulfed her, and she fell to her knees, leaning her forehead against the smooth, cool bark of the tree. "This is a bad idea," she thought, and turned, reaching out for Malfoy in a blind panic. Her desperate hands met air, despite him reaching for her too. 1 minute he was there, just as panicked as she was, and the next he was gone, replaced by nothing and everything. Things that have been, and things that one day would be. The life that she knew was gone. Only the unknown abyss of fluid time stood before her and threatened to drown her in its infinite way. As time flowed, Hermione watched as if she was the tree. Knowledge poured into her, allowing her to understand what she was seeing. Thousands of scenes flashed past at lightning speed. A much older Ginny caressed the trunk of the tree, holding the hand of a little girl with grey eyes, red hair, and a knowing smile on her tiny, rosy lips. Lucius, as a boy, his back resting against her as he sketched the manor. Abraxas Malfoy, with his hands inside the robe of a pretty witch who was pressed against Hermione's tree-like body. Septimus Malfoy, who stood still, staring open-mouthed at her as she suddenly separated the tree, having been effectively spit out. The abrupt way she was expelled from the tree made her even dizzier than she already was. How could it be possible that she merged with the conscious of the tree? She struggled to come to herself, to separate from the living conscious of the tree, and reconcile to only being Hermione Granger once more. If she had experienced even a tiny portion of what the Smurg experienced, she now thought of the beings with a greater respect. It was no easy thing to be connected to something so overwhelmingly powerful and inhumane.
"Who are you?"
Septimus asked. He was shorter than Draco, but the hair was the same. She smirked because she couldn't imagine any Malfoy heir without it. His bright blue eyes surprised her, though, having always associated the Malfoy blonde with steel-grey eyes. In fact, his eyes reminded her of Ron. "Hermione Slytherin," she muttered, trying to clear her head from the massive amount of sensory input the tree had forced on her. "What year is it?" He looked at her like she was dangerous beast about to spring and said,
1925.
"Merlin!" she gasped. So much for going back 10 years. She was in the roaring 20s. Hermione ignored Septimus and started to walk down the rise, heading away from the manor. Never did she plan on stepping a single foot in that monstrosity ever again, and that would be too soon.
"Wait, where are you going? My father is going to hear about this,"
he screeched in a nasally, decidedly feminine voice. Hermione giggled, ridiculously pleased that not every Malfoy ancestor looked like a walking wet dream. "Good. Have fun with that." She wiggled her fingers before apparating to Diagon Alley. With a swift flick of her wand, she transfigured her robes into something she had seen in Narcissa's vintage collection. A slim black timeless number that was entirely respectable and incredibly flattering. She could use all the allies she could get, and clothing seemed to matter to the pureblood faction. There was no reason to alienate anyone because of how she was dressed. She had come much too far for that. Plus, Malfoy didn't have to include the overwhelming snobbery of the old families in his crash course of what she needed to know. She learned that very early on. Hermione felt exactly as she felt the first year that she popped in Diagon Alley, odd and slightly out of place. Happy people milled around her, streaming in and out of busy stores. The shops were well stocked and hung with gleaming posters of smiling witches and wizards. Diagon Alley was brilliant, gleaming, and she looked around in astonishment. The alley from her time looked dead in comparison. Every storefront was decked out, every store full of patrons. Children still flocked to Fortescue, and Apothecary was so full the line wove down the lane. This was Diagon Alley in its heyday, and Hermione was humbled that she was able to see it, the way it was meant to be. The Wizarding shopping district without the influence of 2 civil wars. Hermione strolled down the lane, making her way slowly but surely to Gringotts, and tried to hide the fact that her heart was racing and that she was starting to sweat. No one stopped her or attempted to converse. She was an outsider for now, but Draco had assured her that would only last as long as her trip to the bank, where she would loudly proclaim her heritage. Once the goblins accepted her, so too would the Wizarding world. Wizards trusted goblins in housing their gold and making sure that the proper bloodlines received their vaults after their demise. Goblins seemed to have an uncanny knack for inheritance laws. Goblins stood on either side of the doorway into the bank and watched her with their black, beady eyes. Did they know that she stole from these walls? Could they tell that she was one of 4 people that successfully laid claim to that feat? Was there a way for past, present, and future goblins to correspond? Was she going to die a painful death after she walked through those silver-inscribed doors, warning thieves away? Now that she didn't have Malfoy standing next to her, she wasn't so sure. Refusing to break her stride, Hermione ignored the goblins that stood sentry and stepped into the main atrium of the bank, a great marbled monstrosity that was overlaid with gold leaf and treasures untold. She would find out soon enough if her mission was to end before it even began. "How can I help you?" a very young Gryffindor asked from behind the first counter. Hermione smiled wildly, glad to know someone, even if he didn't know her yet. Slowly, she pulled a golden key from her robe pocket, and in a clear voice that carried through the room and echoed, she said, "I would like to access my family vault." "And you are?" "Hermione Slytherin." Out of the corner of her eyes, she saw 6 men stop dead. The hunger nearly radiated off of them as they mentally conspired to trap her in a matrimony to one relation or another. The Slytherin fortune was renowned, after all, and would make a sizable addition to any of the pure-blooded familial vaults. It was exactly the reaction she was hoping for. According to Draco, there was no better protection from the blood feudis than to be considered a part of the eligible prospects for marriage. She just hoped that Draco was over-exaggerating the lengths to which he said the paterfamilias would descend to trap her. She had no interest in marriage or politics. She was here for one reason, and one reason alone: Tom Marvolo Riddle. But having the old families on her side would give her access to any resource she could possibly need. Gryffindor's eyes narrowed as he took the key from her fingers. "Right this way, Lady Slytherin." She followed him out of the atrium into the cart, holding on tight. Her jaw and eyelids clambered shut. Her stomach rolled and heaved with each twist, and she was convinced that even if she did this every day for the rest of her life, she would never get used to it. The cart shuddered to a stop, and Hermione climbed out, her face an unflattering shade of green. The chimera reared as they walked closer, caught between the desire to eat them and shrink away from the possibility of cruel biting whips held by unforgiving goblins. In the end, the chimera cowered against the solid rock of the vault face, far enough from the entrance to secure the safety of the owner of said vault. The moment Hermione's magic reached out to the vault door, it melted away, leaving the mound of treasure bare to their eyes. "This has to be the work of a goblin," Gryffindor whispered to himself. Hermione chuckled and patted his shoulder before entering the vault and grabbing another bag of gold to add to her beaded bag. Briefly, she looked around at all the treasures that had been hidden in the sealed vault for hundreds of years and wished she had the time to go through it all. Once her mission was completed satisfactorily, she would spend days down there cataloguing the whole. When she climbed back into the cart with Gryffindor, he was moving a large metal disc between his fingers, staring at it so hard she thought it would combust from the intensity. "What's that?" she asked curiously. Without looking at her, he slid it into his trousers pockets and said, "Just a little oddity that was given to me for services rendered. Something from the Malfoy vault that somehow still sits there today and yet is impossibly in your hands?" she asked slyly.
"Indeed, Lady Slytherin, indeed."
The cart ride back to the atrium was just as horrid as she remembered, and she tried to hide how sick it made her, knowing that by now there would be influential people waiting to catch a glimpse of the Slytherin heir. People that she may need in the future, and people she had every intention of befriending, such as the Black family. She owed it to Harry to make sure that Sirius, when he was born, had a better life than the one he lived.
"A bit of advice?"
Griffith muttered to her before opening the doors to the lobby. Hermione turned to him and raised her brows.
"Whatever you are doing here in this time, you are the name you took. Forget who and what you used to be. Forget where you came from. Forget the future. This is your time now, and you can never go back, especially if you came here the way I suspect you have. Live this life as if it is your first and last. You aren't changing the future. You are living in the present."
"I'll keep that in mind."
"If you don't, you'll go mad."
They stared at each other for several minutes until Hermione nodded and Griffith led her back into the lobby. She smiled woodenly as she left his advice rolling around her head. She could never in a million years forget where she came from or what that life was like. It molded her, shaped her into the person she was. That life is the entire reason she was here, and nothing he could say would change it. Whispers followed her back through the alley, but no one was brave enough to approach her yet. And that suited her because she wasn't in the mood to make noise. She was alone and unsure and scared, but not without resources. There were people she could and would reach out to, namely Albus Dumbledore. The leaky cauldron was as it ever will be, although perhaps a bit cleaner.
"Can I help you?"
the young barman asked. Hermione smiled at Tom, remembering how kind he always was to her as a girl. "I need to let a room. Do you have one available?"
"Shall do. How long are you staying with us?"
he asked as he handed over an ancient-looking iron skeleton key with the number 7 on a leather tag. "I don't know yet."
"Not a problem. Take as long as you need."
"Thank you." She smiled and walked up the stairs, heading for privacy at last. Once she opened the door, she looked around and smiled. It was the same, exactly the same as it was when she last stayed at the inn, but the furniture was newer and cleaner. Quietly, she shut the door and sat on the bed, letting everything catch up with her. She was in 1925. That was 1 year before Tom Riddle would be born. Why would the Smurg bring her here? What difference would 1 year make? Was she supposed to prevent Tom from being born? Griffith's advice flooded her brain. Forget her old life. Her promise to the Smurg to try and treat people who hurt her better than they deserved, as if they never even met. Promises to Malfoy and Harry's dead body and everyone who took a curse for Harry or Ron or her. The promise to make a better world for those that she loved. To try and treat her enemies as if they never even met. That meant she couldn't kill Tom. Not without provocation. Provocation in this time, anyway. Griffith was right. Malfoy was right. She couldn't make things right for the people she loved by destroying their enemies on sight. She had promised to try. It was the only reason the Smurg had granted her request, and she would do everything in her power to honor the spirit in which it was given. What would be the best thing to do? Should she put down roots and adopt Tom? Should she find Merope and help her now? Hermione needed an ally. Whatever she chose to do, she would need help, and who better to be on her side than Albus Dumbledore? Knowing that he was now Transfiguration teacher at Hogwarts, Hermione quickly pulled her beaded bag on her lap. "Accio ink, Accio parchment." The moment he touched her hand, she laid them out and the small table next to her bed and began to write. "Professor Dumbledore, allow me to introduce myself. I am Hermione Slytherin. It would be a pleasure to meet you in person, and I imagine you would have many questions for me. Please let me know your earliest convenience. Hermione J.G. Slytherin." Hermione left the room and walked to the owl order service and sent a letter via one of the mail owls for hire. At least this hadn't changed from what she knew. She slowly walked back to the leaky, smiling at everyone she passed. Everything reminded her of them, Harry and Ron. Bittersweet hope swirled around in her stomach. If she had any say, they would live great lives and never be exposed to the blood war that stole their childhoods and lives. They would just have to do it without her. She wasn't sure what the repercussions of time travel would be on her own younger self, but she had a horrible suspicion that she would no longer exist in her normal time. But all of these sacrifices would be worth it in the end. What was her sacrifice compared to theirs? They all died. She was not dead. She was merely living another life. Surviving was at times its own hell. Hermione walked into the leaky and stopped dead in the doorway, causing an elder witch to bump into her and start complaining about the abhorrent youth of the day, their declining manners, as if every generation prior to hers hadn't said the exact same thing. "Sorry," Hermione mumbled distractedly before moving out of the way, skulking to the back of the pub to lean against the wooden wall and observe the group of 6 young men who clustered around a large table off to the side. The scene pulled her in, and she was incapable of pulling herself away. Though they looked slightly different than their progeny, she could place them anywhere. Hermione desperately wished to join them.
"I'm telling you, Charles, her eyes were glued on you all night long. I've heard your arguments, but I think you're wrong. I swear on Merlin's saggy fronts that Doria Black was checking you out," Alistair Moody announced. He was just a boy, no scars or missing flesh in sight, but most disconcerting of all was the look of him with 2 natural blue eyes.
"Moody, you're out of your mind if you think a Slytherin girl is interested in a Gryffindor," Charles Potter.
It had to be. The resemblance to Harry and James was uncanny, except he had the most beautiful ocean green eyes she had ever seen. Their eyes met across the room, and he smirked at her. She immediately turned away, having been caught moving around the room to a different location so as not to miss the conversation.
"Ha! Go say hello to her next time, and I bet 5 galleons that she blushes no matter what you say to her,"
Moody said, oblivious to his friend's distraction.
"I second that."
Another young man, raising his pint and clanking the tankard together against Moody's. Hermione's stomach twisted with longing. That could have been her and Harry and Ron without the war. Charles got up, muttering something about the loo, but the conversation went on without him.
"He wasn't the only one attracting attention now, was he, Longbottom? That Ravenclaw girl has been dogging you for weeks now. What was her name? Augusta?"
Moody laughed at the red face of the boy who had seconded the bet while teasing Potter, who was now choking over his drink, while another boy smacked his back with the force. "Lust," a voice whispered in her ear. She knew that voice. It was a voice that she worked hard at never forgetting. Harry. She whipped around and stared as if she were a deer caught in the headline. Why else would a lovely unknown woman eavesdrop off a group of mates out on the town? He continued. She stammered. Yes? He leaned closer, resting his forearm against the wall above her head. You look just like my brother. Harry was as good as her brother, and no one would catch her in a lie anyway. He died 6 months ago. Oh, he said, dropping his arm and stepping back a bit. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. I didn't mean to intrude, No, it's okay. I'm Charles Potter, and you're? Hermione Slytherin. Slytherin, as in the founder of Hogwarts. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Don't you have some family code that prevents you from mingling with Gryffindors? That would be stupid. He smiled, putting his arm back up on the wall. Yeah, it would be. Join us. I can't, she said, obviously disappointed in her own choice. I'm waiting for an important post. Maybe next time, then. He smirked, just like Sirius used to, and her heart pounded in the remembered crush she had 5th year on the flirtatious marauder. If you change your mind, you know where we'll be. Thanks, she muttered before fleeing. Half of her desperately wanted to take him up on the offer and pretended that he was really Harry. The other half of her couldn't stomach the thought of being so close, and yet she flew up the stairs and slammed the door, closed behind her, leaning heavily against it. Tears were welling in her eyes, and she covered her face with her trembling hands. She was falling apart, and she couldn't afford that. She was here for Tom. Changing Tom's life was all that mattered. Hermione slid into bed and was well on her way to falling asleep when she finally heard a light tapping on the window. Her eyes flew wide, and a relieved chuckle dropped from her lips as she walked to the window. She knew he wouldn't be able to resist that note. Thank Merlin. "Hey, pretty owl," she said, stroking the barn owl's lovely feathers before untying the tightly rolled scroll.
"Miss Slytherin, I'm skeptical that you are who you say you are. The Slytherin name died out several centuries ago. I'm intrigued by what you think I would want to ask you about. I'm free tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'm unable to leave Hogwarts at this time, but if you are not too inconvenienced, I will have someone wait for you at the gate. Professor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." Hermione flipped the scroll over and scribbled a quick agreement and sent it back. Once the window was closed, she did a little dance. She had him. All she needed was some mystery and a bit of courage. She hadn't been sorted into Gryffindor for no reason. If there were two things she had, it would be intelligence and nerve. She slid back into the bed with a happy sigh. She wouldn't waste this chance to change things. She only had this one chance. She couldn't afford to muck it up. Hermione was fidgeting. The robes were uncomfortable, her hair was a bushy mess, and worst of all, she had been proposed to twice on the way to the apparition point in Diagon Alley. Her appearance in Gringotts had quickly and eagerly ignited a firestorm of gossip, acknowledging that she was a Slytherin and had the familiar vaults to prove it. As a result, she was forced to tell the elderly Lord Selwyn that she was not going to marry his grandson. She even had to hex Lord Potter, Charles' father, when he got handsy with her. "No, sir, I don't want to be Harry Potter's great step-grandmother, thank you very much." She rolled her eye. It was unbelievable, the length that these pure-blood families went to obtain wealth, power, and beauty. She released a sigh of relief as she made it to the Hogwarts gates. She looked up at the old castle, feeling the comforting wards brush against her familiarly. "You Miss Slytherin?"
asked a rough, deep voice. "Yes."
"Follow me."
The gates cracked open almost ominously. Hermione squeezed the tiny opening in order to follow the gruff men to the castle. Hermione looked around curiously as they began to pass the current students. Everyone was friendly, flashing smiles at her as she went. Their robes were longer, less tailored, and made of wool. Hermione did not envy this generation. The gruff man knocked on a door that she assumed was Dumbledore's office. He didn't even wait to be sure Dumbledore was in. He left her standing there in the hall, shifting from foot to foot awkwardly. She was starting to believe he wasn't in his office at all.
"You must be Miss Slytherin,"
Dumbledore said from behind her. He twinkled as he opened the door and gestured for her to precede him. She smiled her thanks before sitting in one of the offered chairs. "Thank you," Hermione said politely. She was slightly enjoying having the drop on him.
"What can I help you with?"
Albus asked curiously as he settled behind his desk.
"Lemon drop?"
"No, thank you, Professor," she smiled. "I have no idea where to begin or even how much to tell you," she muttered.
"I think you start at the beginning,"
he said patiently. "I expect discretion, sir."
"Of course."
"I am a time traveller."
"Extraordinary."
He twinkled and leaned forward in his seat. "I meant to go back on the Decker to stop a war from decimating Wizarding Britain, but I ended up here, 74 years in the past. I'm not really sure where to start. I figured that if anyone could help me, it would be you."
"Am I to assume you are a Hogwarts graduate?"
"No, I completed up to my 6th year. That's what happens when you search Britain for Horcruxes."
"Merlin, Horcruxes? As in more than one? Who would do that?"
"Someone that isn't born yet." He narrowed his eyes at her evasive answer.
"I am under the impression that the Slytherin familiar line died out."
Dumbledore changed the course of the conversation at lightning speed. Hermione blinked for a moment in surprise. "I needed access to my wealth, no matter what time period I landed in. The goblins and I worked out a deal. In the end, I was adopted into the Slytherin family, and their vaults were released to me, and my magical signature was used in the warding."
"What price did you have to pay for that?"
"I didn't. I was fortunate enough to have a sponsor."
"And that was?"
"The Malfoy family."
"Curious."
"Indeed."
"So, how did you time travel? There are no current means."
"That you know of," Hermione mumbled. Dumbledore perked up curiously, having heard her utterance.
"Well?"
"I will talk about the future. I will tell you things, but I will not tell you this. Please leave it." Dumbledore looked at her, and Hermione strengthened her occlumency shields as she felt his mind probe hers. Her stomach sunk. He wasn't even subtle about it. If you don't withdraw from my mind right now, I will not hesitate to protect myself by any means necessary." Hermione warned as she glared at him. His eyebrows rose. He withdrew fast, not gently either, causing Hermione to wince at the blunt's retreat. "I've killed," she whispered in shame. "I've concluded that you and I aren't so very different, Professor. Both of our deepest desires revolve around the wish to see our loved ones stay alive, and we will do anything, commit any atrocity, to make sure that happens. This is why it must be you. Out of anyone in the world, you are probably the only person capable of understanding my decisions."
"That may have been true once."
"You can lie to yourself all you want, Albus Dumbledore, but you cannot lie to me, not about this."
"How did you come back?"
he persisted. She stared at him for a moment. This was not the Dumbledore that she knew. This Albus Dumbledore only had the potential to be that man she knew. She doubted very much that he would be able to help her very much at this point. The Dumbledore she knew may have manipulated, callously used others, but he never buried his head in the sand. Not to himself, anyway. She needed the help of a man who defeated Grindelwald, who put Harry in a sub-bar home, kept Sirius locked up in Grimmauld Place and Azkaban without a trial, who hired Lockhart and avoided Harry for an entire year. The man who looked the other way when the trial fought Voldemort and his servants each and every day. The man who gave Dobby a job and hired a werewolf and a former repentant Death Eater. The man who liked woolen socks and knitting because Ariana liked them and would spend her time knitting them for Albus before she died. Why was Dumbledore so different, so unprepared? It came to her like a hammer to the head. He would only be ready for the war with Voldemort because of his victory against Grindelwald. "I am blessed," she said simply. She was no different than he would someday be. Hermione sacrificed generations of Malfoy girls to come back. One could even say that she did it for the greater good. Her lips twisted in derision and self-disgust. "If I had another option, any other method, I wouldn't have chosen this."
"You paid that great a price?"
"Me? No. I volunteered others to shoulder that burden. See, we are the same." The disgust practically oozed out of her.
"I wouldn't make someone else pay for my choices."
"Lies, Professor. You will someday become a general of a brutal war. You will use child soldiers, manipulate us all like the chess pieces we are to you, and exploit another until he becomes the hardened spy that he needs to be. Don't lie to me," she exploded, telling him more than she intended to.
"Why are you here?"
"I need to find someone."
"Who?"
"Marvolo Gaunt."
"Last I knew, he lived with his children in the little Hangleton, but none of his children ever attended Hogwarts. He is a nasty piece of work, always in the Daily Prophet for some muggle baiting or another."
"Thank you."
"What do you need from me?"
"An ally, a focus point, an anchor." He took a great shaking breath and covered his face, his auburn beard peeking out beneath.
"You don't seem to be that concerned about Gellert," he muttered.
"He was defeated in my time. I'm not sure exactly how to handle this. I learned about his rise and fall in history of magic."
"How powerful are you?"
he asked suddenly. "I was hailed the most brilliant witch of my age," she said with more self-loathing.
"Duel me?"
"Seriously?" Hermione asked. She suddenly began bouncing with excitement, her whole body vibrating with anticipation. If she could take her focus off of the weight that was on her shoulders for only one moment, she would take it. She was going to duel with the great Albus Dumbledore. She knew he was talented even as a student and quivered with the thought of learning from him.
"Yes?"
He smiled at her childlike exuberance.
"Saturday at 1 on the Quidditch pitch."
"Awesome!" she squeaked.
"Also, I will set up the newts for you to take. I will give you the date the next time I see you."
She jumped out of her chair and grasped the handle of the door.
"Oh, and Miss Slytherin? What house were you in when you attended?"
"Gryffindor, sir." Hermione laughed at his surprise and led herself out of his office, the castle, and Hogsmeade before apparating back to the Leaky Cauldron. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Smurg by Jessiy. Read by Ella Max Mabella. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr.